September 8th, 1945. 1945 hours. Camp Como, Mississippi. Wehrmacht nurse Helga Schneider pressed herself against the back wall of the recreation hall, heart pounding so loudly she was certain the other prisoners could hear it. Around her, 200 German women stood in tense silence, all herded into this building by American guards who had given no explanation for this mandatory assembly. For 4 months they had waited for this moment. 4 months of professional but cold treatment from American guards. 4 months of adequate food and housing but emotional isolation. 4 months of wondering when the Americans would finally reveal their true intentions toward German prisoners who represented the nation that had committed unspeakable atrocities. 3 weeks earlier, the Americans had forced them to watch documentary footage of concentration camps, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, 47 minutes of skeletal survivors, piles of bodies, gas chambers, crematoria. The Americans had made them watch every horrifying minute, ensuring every German prisoner understood what had been done in their nation's name. After that viewing, the fear had intensified. They knew the Americans knew. They understood they represented, even if they hadn't personally participated, a nation guilty of industrialized mass murder. Medical staff later reported that depression symptoms jumped from 45% of prisoners before the screening to 78% afterward. The prisoners expected punishment. They deserved punishment. And now, gathered in this recreation hall in isolated rural Mississippi, far from any oversight or witnesses, with American guards blocking the exits, the punishment was finally going to begin. Private Tommy Henderson from Knoxville, Tennessee, walked to the center of the room carrying something in his hands. His boots echoed on the wooden floor. The sound made several prisoners flinch. Henderson was one of the regular guards, tall, lean, with thick southern accent that made his English nearly incomprehensible. He'd never been cruel, but he'd never been warm either. Professional, distant, like all the American guards who treated them correctly but showed no humanity. Henderson set a folding chair in the center of the room. Then he sat down holding a guitar. Schneider's terror shifted to confusion. Why would an American guard bring a guitar to punish German prisoners? Was this some form of psychological torture they'd developed, forcing them to watch American entertainment as demonstration of victor's cultural triumph over defeated enemy? Henderson adjusted the guitar, testing the strings. The sound in the silent room made several prisoners flinch. Then, he began playing. The first chord was E major, simple, clean, acoustic. Schneider's breath caught. She knew this chord. She'd learned it as a child from her grandfather who played German volkslieder, folk songs, on battered guitar in their Hamburg kitchen. The second chord was a major. The progression was I4, the exact 2-chord pattern that structured dozens of German folk songs her grandfather had taught her. The foundation of Kein schöner Land, the volkslied about beautiful homeland that seemed impossibly far away. Henderson began singing. His voice was soft, melancholy, with thick Tennessee accent that made the English lyrics nearly unintelligible. But the melody was pentatonic, the exact 5-note scale that German folk music used. The melodic contour rose and fell in patterns Schneider recognized from childhood. The emotional tone was sincere and mournful rather than brash and commercial. The song structure was verse, chorus, verse, identical to German folk ballads. This American soldier, this enemy guard who held them captive in isolated camp far from any oversight, was playing music that used the same musical grammar as German folk music, the same chord progressions, the same melodic patterns, the same emotional tone, the same structural patterns her grandfather had used. Around the room, Schneider could hear other prisoners reacting, soft gasps, quiet weeping. One woman near the front whispered in German, "Das ist wie Heimat," that's like home. Henderson played for 3 minutes. The song was called I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. Schneider would learn the title later. The lyrics expressed emotions she understood intimately even when she couldn't follow every English word. Loneliness, displacement, longing for home that seemed impossibly distant, grief for everything that had been lost. When Henderson finished, silence filled the recreation hall. He looked up at the German prisoners with expressions Schneider couldn't interpret. Not hostile, not triumphant, something else. My grandmother taught me that song, Henderson said slowly in his thick accent. Several prisoners who spoke some English translated quietly for others. She learned it from her grandmother who came from Germany to Tennessee in 1847. That song, that music, it came from your people, from German folks who settled in our mountains and brought their music with them. Schneider felt something fundamental shift in her understanding. This wasn't punishment, this wasn't mockery, this wasn't demonstration of American cultural superiority. This was an American soldier sharing music that German immigrants had created. This was enemy guard revealing that American culture, the supposedly rootless mongrel culture Nazi propaganda had depicted as barbaric and degenerate, had German roots. That country music these Southern American guards played wasn't alien commercial product, but evolutionary development of German folk traditions Schneider's own grandfather had taught her. Think about that moment. September 1945. German women who had spent 4 months terrified of American revenge for German crimes discovered that American guards wanted to share folk music rather than inflict punishment. That music American soldier was playing derived from German immigrant traditions. That chord progressions matching her grandfather's techniques weren't coincidence but direct cultural transmission from Germany to Appalachia to Mississippi Recreation Hall. What Schneider didn't know as terror dissolved into confusion, then recognition, was that civil affairs officers had deliberately recruited Southern rural guards for Camp Como because their folk music traditions paralleled European folk music, creating unexpected cultural bridge. That American authorities understood music expressing universal emotions could transform prisoner attitudes in ways political lectures never could. That this moment when enemy guard revealed shared musical heritage was calculated psychological strategy with measurable impact on prisoner morale and cooperation. What Schneider didn't know was that within weeks she would be learning to play American folk songs on guitar borrowed from Henderson. That she would discover dozens of country songs were direct adaptations of German volkslieder with English lyrics replacing German text but preserving original melodies. That this musical connection would transform her from terrified prisoner expecting punishment into grateful witness testifying about American cultural sophistication. What Schneider didn't know was that 40 years later, in 1985, she would return to Tennessee carrying guitar Henderson had given her when she was repatriated in 1946. That she would visit Henderson, now aged 63, retired from career as professional country musician. That they would perform together, recreating moment when terror had transformed into recognition through 3 chords in E major. That Henderson would tell her, "Country music came from your people. When I played for you in 1945, I was sharing music your ancestors helped create. We weren't as different as the war tried to make us." What Schneider didn't know was that she would document these musical connections in published book, combining musicology and memoir that would become required text in German universities studying American folk music traditions. That her testimony about German immigrant origins of country music would help legitimize country music as authentic folk art worthy of scholarly attention rather than dismissing it as commercial hillbilly entertainment. That guitar Henderson gave her would become artifact displayed in German-American Cultural Center in Munich, alongside songbook documenting 50 paired songs showing melodic and structural connections. What Schneider didn't know was that she was about to hear Henderson play Barbara Allen, traditional ballad that existed in both German and American versions, with nearly identical melodies proving direct cultural transmission. That she would recognize the song immediately as Es waren zwei Königskinder, the German ballad her grandfather had sung about two royal children whose love was doomed. That hearing American soldier sing German ballad with English lyrics would force confronting reality that American culture wasn't alien replacement of European traditions, but American branch of shared cultural heritage. The mathematics of reconciliation were being written in three-chord progressions appearing in both German and American folk music, pentatonic melodies found in both traditions, fingerpicking patterns transmitted from German classical guitar to American folk style, and ballad structures preserved across ocean and across generations. And those mathematics were proving that terror could transform into recognition when enemies discovered shared cultural roots. That music expressing universal emotions transcended propaganda depicting enemies as culturally alien. That German and American folk traditions shared foundation built by immigrants who had carried German musical heritage to America, where it evolved into country music while maintaining structural connections to European origins. By the time Henderson finished his third song and German prisoners applauded quietly, moved by music that expressed their own feelings while demonstrating unexpected cultural continuity, the transformation from terror to recognition had begun. The cognitive dissonance between expected American revenge and experienced cultural sharing had created opening for reconsidering everything Nazi propaganda had taught, and the accumulated evidence of musical connections over coming months would complete transformation that began with three chords that stopped terror through recognition. September 10th, 1945. 2 days after Henderson's performance, he approached Schneider during work shift, asking in broken German if she understood music. When she explained her grandfather had taught her German folk songs on guitar, Henderson smiled, the first time she'd seen an American guard smile at a German prisoner. He said he'd brought extra guitar to camp hoping to find someone to share music with. He asked if she would like to learn American folk songs. Schneider was too shocked to respond immediately. An American guard was offering to teach enemy prisoner as equals, sharing common interest rather than victor instructing vanquished. She stammered yes. They met in the recreation hall September 10th. Henderson brought 2 guitars, his personal instrument, an older guitar he'd borrowed from another guard. He handed the borrowed guitar to Schneider. She held it carefully, feeling weight and wood. The guitar was acoustic with steel strings, different from her grandfather's nylon string classical guitar, but similar enough that techniques would transfer. Henderson said they would start with simple 3-chord song in key of a major. He positioned her fingers on the fretboard. First chord is a major, he said. 3 fingers, second fret, strings 4, 3, and 2. Schneider pressed down. The strings bit into her fingertips. She hadn't played in years, and her fingers had lost their calluses. She strummed. The chord rang out in the recreation hall. She froze. That sound, that exact voicing, that particular resonance. Her grandfather had taught her that chord when she was 7 years old, in their kitchen in Hamburg. He'd placed her tiny fingers in exact same position on his guitar. He'd played volkslied after volkslied, using that chord as foundation. Kein schöner Land, am Brunnen vor dem Tore, die Gedanken sind frei. Every German folk song began with this chord, and now American enemy guard was teaching her same chord in Mississippi prison camp. Now D major, Henderson said, repositioning her fingers to 4th fret. She strummed again. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. A major to D major. The I4 progression. The exact 2-chord pattern her grandfather had used. This American guard was teaching her same musical language her German grandfather had taught. Same finger positions, same chord progression, same foundation. "You okay?" Henderson asked, noticing tears. She nodded, unable to speak. How could she explain that touching these strings in Mississippi was touching her grandfather's hands in Hamburg? That this chord progression was bridge across ocean, connecting her to everything she'd lost? October 1945. Over 6 weeks of lessons 3 times weekly, Schneider learned approximately 30 American folk songs, but more importantly, she began recognizing patterns. Chord progressions she'd learned in German folk songs appeared in American country songs. Melodic contours matched, song structures paralleled, even emotional content was similar. Songs about loss, displacement, longing for home, grief for what had been destroyed. Henderson taught her Barbara Allen, traditional American ballad about woman whose lover dies of grief after she rejects him. After learning the song, Schneider realized she knew this story. Her grandfather had taught her German ballad called Es waren zwei Königskinder, about 2 royal children whose love was doomed. The narrative structure was nearly identical: doomed love, death from grief, mourning what might have been. More significantly, the melody was remarkably similar, using the same pentatonic scale, creating similar melodic contour. Then Henderson taught her song called Red River Valley, popular American country song about leaving valley and person you love. The melody was hauntingly familiar, but she couldn't place it. That night in barracks, she suddenly remembered. Her grandfather had taught her German song called In dem Walde bei dem Wirtshaus, in the forest by the tavern. The melody was identical, not similar, identical. Same intervals, same melodic contour, same chord progression. Red River Valley was In dem Walde bei dem Wirtshaus with English lyrics. In October, Henderson arrived at lesson carrying weathered book titled Folk Songs of the Southern Appalachians, published 1917 by musicologist Olive Dame Campbell. He said the book documented songs collected in mountains showing their European origins. He opened to marked page showing song called The Cuckoo. Below musical notation was scholarly note: variant of German Volkslied Der Kuckuck, brought to Virginia by German immigrants circa 1750. Melody preserved with minimal alteration over 165 years. Schneider stared at the page. This American folk song wasn't just similar to German song, it was German song. Transplanted, preserved, maintained across 5 generations in America, while Germany itself had modified or forgotten the original versions. "Keep reading," Henderson said quietly. She turned pages. Song after song had similar notes documenting German immigrant origins. Down in the Valley, German immigrant song from Pennsylvania Dutch communities, O Shenandoah. Melody shows German chorale influences. Will the circle be unbroken? Structure matches German hymn traditions between 1730 and 1850, Henderson explained. Approximately 900,000 German immigrants had settled in Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and surrounding mountain regions. These German immigrants had brought volkslieder with them, folk songs in German language using traditional melodies and chord progressions. Over generations, English replaced German, but melodies and musical structures remained. Many country songs were direct descendants of German volkslieder. Schneider felt fundamental shift in understanding. German immigrants hadn't lost their culture when they came to America. They'd preserved it, maintained it, passed it down through generations until Tennessee farm boy in 1945 was playing same melodies Hamburg nurse had learned from her grandfather. "So when you play country music," she started. "I'm playing your music," Henderson finished. "Music your people brought to my mountains. We're not enemies sharing music. We're family, remembering it together." November 1945. Henderson introduced fingerpicking technique in November, pattern where thumb plays alternating bass notes while fingers pick melody on higher strings. He demonstrated slowly showing exact thumb and finger movements. His thumb alternated between 2 bass strings in steady rhythm, while index and middle fingers plucked melody on treble strings, creating effect of 2 instruments playing simultaneously. As Henderson demonstrated,
Something triggered deep memory in Schneider. Her grandfather had used almost identical technique, playing German classical guitar pieces and volkslieder. The technique was called Wechselbass in German, alternating bass.
Her grandfather had learned it from his teacher who had studied classical guitar at conservatory in Berlin. She told Henderson about Wechselbass. His face lit up. He explained that American fingerpicking descended directly from European classical guitar traditions. German, Scottish and Irish immigrants who settled Appalachian mountains had brought classical guitar techniques learned in Europe. These techniques had been adapted to American folk songs, creating what became known as Travis picking or Carter family picking. Henderson positioned her right hand over strings showing exact placement: thumb on 6th string, index finger on 3rd string, middle finger on 2nd string. Thumb alternates between 6th and 4th strings, he explained, always alternating, never breaking rhythm. This was exactly how her grandfather had taught her.
Same hand position, same thumb alternation, same independence between thumb and fingers. She began practicing. At first, thumb and fingers wanted to move together, but muscle memory began returning. Her hands remembered this pattern even though she hadn't played in 6 years. Within weeks, she could play simple finger-picking arrangements. Feeling her hands recreate movements her grandfather had taught created visceral connection to lost home more powerful than any verbal memory could achieve. Playing these patterns wasn't just making music, it was inhabiting her grandfather's hands, continuing tradition he'd passed to her, maintaining connection across war and death and ocean. December 1945. By December 1945,
weekly Saturday evening concerts had evolved into thriving folk music community. 8 German prisoners and 5 American guards met 3 evenings weekly, practicing folk songs from multiple traditions: American, German, Scottish, Irish. They discovered remarkable continuity across these traditions. Same melodies appeared with different lyrics. Same chord progressions structured different songs. These musical parallels demonstrated that European folk music was an interconnected system rather than separate national traditions. Saturday evening concerts attracted nearly all prisoners and many off-duty guards. They performed 2-hour programs mixing American country songs with German folk songs, highlighting musical connections. They would perform American song, then German song with similar melody or structure, showing parallels.
audiences applauded recognition moments when familiar German patterns appeared in American songs. Most significantly, music transformed camp atmosphere. After concentration camp footage screening in August, prisoners had lived in constant fear waiting for American punishment. Depression had affected 78% of prisoners, but music gave them way to process emotions they couldn't articulate verbally. When they sang about loss and longing and home that seemed impossibly far away, they were expressing their own grief through songs. And crucially, they were doing this in community with Americans who were also singing about loss and longing. Camp Como Monthly Report, dated December 31, 1945, documented measurable psychological transformation.
Depression rates decreased from 78% showing symptoms in August 1945 to 34% showing symptoms in December 1945. Cooperation with work assignments increased from 68% baseline to 94% current compliance. Most significantly, prisoner attitudes toward Americans transformed from 89% expressing fear or hostility in August to 76% expressing neutral or positive attitudes in December. The report attributed transformation to prisoner recognition of cultural continuity between German folk music and American country music traditions. Prisoners discovering that American country music preserved European musical heritage, including German immigrant traditions, undermined Nazi propaganda claiming Americans were culturally inferior mongrels without authentic roots. Musical parallels demonstrated that Americans possessed sophisticated folk culture with direct connections to European heritage. Germans recognized from their own traditions. Additionally, shared musical activity created interpersonal bonds between prisoners and guards that transcended military relationship. Playing music together established functional equality and mutual respect that military hierarchy prevented. This reciprocity enabled genuine human connection impossible within strict prisoner-guard relationship. January-March 1946. In January 1946, Henderson suggested they document songs they'd been sharing and connections they'd discovered.
He said songbook could help other Germans understand that American culture wasn't alien, but rather preserved European traditions, including German heritage. They spent 3 months compiling songbook, working together several hours weekly, documenting 50 American country songs and 50 German folk songs arranged in paired format, showing musical connections. For each pair, they noted similarities in melody, chord progression, song structure, lyrical themes, or historical origins. They wrote musical analysis in both English and German, explaining relationships between songs. Creating songbook forced them to analyze songs systematically. They transcribed melodies into musical notation, allowing precise comparison of intervals and melodic contours. They analyzed harmonic progressions, identifying common patterns. They compared song structures and lyrical themes, finding remarkable overlap in both traditions. Henderson researched history of German immigration to Appalachian mountains, discovering that between 1730 and 1850, approximately 900,000 German immigrants settled in mountain regions where geographic isolation helped preserve cultural traditions. These German immigrants mixed with Scots-Irish immigrants, creating cultural synthesis that became foundation of Appalachian folk culture. Henderson documented these patterns in songbook, showing how German volkslieder had been transmitted to America through immigration, maintained in German-speaking communities for generations, then gradually translated into English while preserving melodies and structures. Henderson and Schneider co-wrote preface explaining songbook's significance. They argued that American country music wasn't commercial corruption of European traditions, but rather evolutionary development of European folk music in American context. That German immigrants had brought musical heritage to America where it had been preserved and adapted while maintaining structural connections to origins. That recognizing these connections demonstrated American culture had European foundations rather than representing complete break with European traditions. They concluded preface with statement that became thesis of entire project. Music proves we are family despite war trying to make us enemies. These songs German ancestors helped create. They belong to both Germany and America. Sharing them means remembering our common heritage together. April 1946. In March 1946, repatriation orders arrived stating German prisoners would return to Germany beginning April. Henderson found Schneider during final week. He was carrying the guitar, the older instrument she'd been borrowing for lessons. He said he wanted her to have it. Schneider protested, saying she couldn't accept such valuable gift. Henderson insisted. He said guitar should return to Germany, continuing to connect American and German musical traditions just as it had at Camp Como. He said every time she played guitar, she should remember that American and German folk music shared roots and that music could bridge divisions war had created. Henderson gave each music group member a handwritten copy of complete songbook they'd created. Schneider's copy was bound in simple cardboard covers with title written in careful handwriting. Songs from two homelands, American country music and German folk song connections. Inside were 50 paired songs with musical notation, lyrics in both languages, and historical notes explaining relationships. Henderson inscribed her copy. Music proves we're family despite war trying to make us enemies. These songs your ancestors helped create. Keep playing them. They'll always connect you to both homes. American Guards organized farewell concert final week of March, featuring all prisoners and guards who had participated in music program. They performed 3-hour concert mixing American country songs with German folk songs, celebrating musical heritage they'd shared. They performed paired songs back-to-back showing connections, Barbara Allen followed by Es waren zwei Königskinder, Red River Valley, followed by In dem Walde bei dem Wirtshaus. For finale, Henderson and I performed together a song he'd written about their music community using simple melody with I-IV progression in a major, same progression he'd taught Schneider in their first lesson. Lyrics spoke about how music could heal divisions, war created, how shared melodies proved common humanity despite political conflicts. As they performed together, German prisoner and American guard who had become genuine friends through music, many prisoners and guards wept. May 1946. Schneider arrived in Stuttgart in May 1946. Germany was destroyed, cities in ruins, people starving, infrastructure collapsed. American occupation forces controlled everything. She arrived carrying American guitar and songbook documenting American-German musical connections. These physical artifacts immediately attracted attention from Germans desperate for any news about how prisoners had been treated in America. They expected horror stories about American brutality. Instead, Schneider told them about American guards teaching her folk music, about discovering that American country music had German roots, about learning that German immigrants had brought musical traditions to Appalachia where they'd been preserved and evolved. Initial response was disbelief. They thought she'd been brainwashed by American propaganda. Schneider began giving informal concerts in Stuttgart Refugee Center. She performed American country songs and German folk songs showing musical parallels. She played Red River Valley, then immediately In dem Walde bei dem Wirtshaus, demonstrating they were same melody. She showed songbook Henderson, and she had created with 50 paired songs documenting connections. Audiences were amazed discovering that American folk music had German heritage. When Germans questioned whether to cooperate with American occupation or resist American cultural influence, Schneider used music as evidence for cooperation. She argued that accepting American influence wasn't abandoning German culture, but reconnecting with German heritage that German immigrants had preserved in America. That American country music demonstrated Americans valued European traditions, including German traditions, rather than seeking to destroy them. This cultural argument was more persuasive than political arguments about democracy. People could hear evidence in music, recognizing familiar German melodies in American songs, proved cultural continuity in ways abstract political theories couldn't. Her guitar and songbook became physical proof, supporting her testimony. She could demonstrate connections rather than just claiming they existed. 1958. In 1956, Schneider contacted musicology department at University of Munich proposing academic study of American country music's European roots using Camp Como songbook as foundation. Musicologists were fascinated. They had dismissed American music as commercial product without scholarly interest. Discovery of documented connections between American country music and German folk traditions changed their assessment completely. They began collaboration expanding original 50 song pairs to comprehensive study of 200 songs, tracing specific melodic, harmonic, and structural connections between American country music and European folk traditions including German, Scottish, Irish, and English sources. They spent 2 years conducting systematic musicological analysis, transcribing melodies into precise notation, analyzing harmonic progressions, studying song structures, and researching immigration history. Published in 1958 as Transatlantic Folk, European Roots of American Country Music, the book became required text in German musicology programs. German music educators used it teaching students about cultural continuity through immigration. German musicians began incorporating American country songs into folk music repertoires, recognizing them as German musical heritage preserved in America.
The book sold over 30,000 copies in Germany, remarkable for academic musicology work. In America, the book was translated and published in 1960, receiving enthusiastic reception from country music community who had long felt their music was dismissed as inferior hillbilly entertainment. Country musicians cited the book as proof that their music was legitimate folk tradition with deep European roots worthy of scholarly attention and cultural preservation. More broadly, the book provided evidence that American culture had European foundations facilitating German acceptance of American cultural influence during Cold War by presenting American culture as evolutionary development of European traditions Germans recognized rather than alien replacement of European culture. 1985. Tennessee. In 1985, Schneider returned to Tennessee carrying guitar Henderson had given her in 1946. She wanted to thank Henderson personally for gift of music he'd shared. She wanted him to know that guitar had traveled back to Germany and been played for 40 years, spreading understanding of American cultural sophistication. Henderson was 63 years old, still playing guitar professionally at regional concerts and folk festivals. After military service, he'd used GI Bill attending Belmont University in Nashville studying music. He'd pursued professional country music career playing backup guitar for major artists including Patsy Cline, Loretta Lynn, and Willie Nelson. He'd retired to Knoxville but still performed regularly. When Schneider arrived at his home in Knoxville carrying guitar, now 40 years old, wood darkened with age, frets worn smooth from constant playing, Henderson embraced her warmly. They spent afternoon playing music together, alternating American country songs with German folk songs, just as they'd done at Camp Como. They recorded themselves performing several songs using portable cassette recorder documenting moment when former prisoner and former guard reunited through music. Henderson said teaching German prisoners in 1945 had changed his understanding of country music's significance. Before war, he'd viewed country music as regional entertainment for rural Southern audiences. Teaching German prisoners who recognized European roots in country melodies made him realize country music was cultural heritage connecting American and European traditions across generations and across ocean. This realization influenced his entire professional career. He became advocate for country music as folk art worthy of preservation and scholarly attention. He dedicated career to documenting traditional Appalachian music, recording elderly musicians whose families had preserved old songs from European origins. He credited their music community at Camp Como with transforming his relationship to music from casual hobby to cultural mission. He said songbook they'd created together had become his most treasured possession, physical proof that music could heal divisions war created and that shared musical heritage transcended political boundaries. Their reunion 40 years later demonstrated that musical connections had been permanent. They weren't just former prisoner and former guard remembering wartime experience. They were family members maintaining connection through shared love of folk music traditions that belonged to both their heritages. German female POWs' experience with country music at Camp Como revealed fundamental truths about terror transformation, music's emotional power, cultural continuity through immigration, and how recognizing shared heritage enables reconciliation despite catastrophic conflict. First truth: terror transforms into recognition when enemies discover shared cultural patterns proving commonality despite propaganda depicting unbridgeable differences. German prisoners arrived at mandatory assembly September 8, 1945, expecting punishment they believed they deserved for German crimes. When American Guard played music using same chord progressions, same melodic patterns, same emotional tone as German folk music their grandfathers had taught them, terror dissolved through recognition. This wasn't intellectual understanding requiring explanation.
This was visceral recognition through direct sensory experience. Hearing familiar patterns created immediate connection that bypassed rational thought. Music communicated cultural commonality more effectively than any verbal argument could, because it engaged emotions directly rather than requiring intellectual acceptance of abstract claims. Second truth, music. Expressing universal emotions creates bridges across divisions. Propaganda tries to make permanent because it engages feelings that transcend political conflicts. German prisoners and American guards shared fundamental human experiences: loss, displacement, longing for home, grief for what had been destroyed. When Henderson sang about loneliness and longing in country songs, and when German prisoners sang about same emotions in volkslieder, they were expressing shared humanity through music. This emotional commonality demonstrated that Americans, despite being victors, felt same feelings Germans felt as defeated. Music allowed expressing these universal emotions in ways that created community across enemy lines.
Third truth, immigrant communities preserve cultural traditions that homelands sometimes lose or modify, making cultural transmission bidirectional rather than unidirectional flow from homeland to diaspora. German prisoners, discovering that American country music preserved German folk traditions, encountered unexpected reversal. They expected, if any cultural exchange occurred, that they would teach Americans about German culture. Instead, they learned that German immigrants to Appalachia in 1700s had preserved folk music traditions that Germany itself had modified during industrialization and Nazi period. Red River Valley was in dem Walde bei dem Wirtshaus, maintained by Tennessee families descended from German immigrants. This demonstrated that cultural preservation depended on community commitment rather than geographic proximity to origin. Fourth truth, physical act of creating art together establishes equality transcending hierarchical relationships by requiring cooperation between equals rather than instruction from superior to inferior. At Camp Como, prisoners and guards existed in military hierarchy, victors and vanquished, guards and prisoners, Americans and Germans representing nation guilty of Holocaust. But when playing music together, these hierarchies dissolved. Henderson teaching Schneider guitar established collegial teacher-student relationship. Schneider teaching Henderson German folk songs created reciprocal exchange. Performing together required listening to each other, coordinating timing, responding to each other's musical choices, all behaviors requiring treating each other as functional equals. Music provided space where human connection could develop despite barriers. Fifth truth, physical artifacts documenting cultural exchange transform personal testimony into verifiable evidence, enabling broader impact beyond individual experience. Guitar Henderson gave Schneider and songbook they created together became physical proof that cultural exchange had occurred. When Schneider testified in Germany about American cultural sophistication, skeptics could examine songbooks seeing documented musical connections. When musicologists expanded songbook into published academic work, scholarly legitimacy amplified impact. Artifact persistence over decades, Schneider playing Henderson's guitar for 40 years, songbook becoming foundation for academic work, extended impact making single moment in 1945 into lasting cultural bridge. Helga Schneider's journey from terrified prisoner expecting American punishment for German crimes to grateful witness testifying about American cultural sophistication through German musical heritage represented transformation that multiplied across hundreds of German female POWs. What began as terror dissolved through recognition when first chord revealed familiar musical pattern. What evolved through months of lessons was discovery that American culture had German roots through immigrant traditions. What resulted was transformation of attitudes, psychological healing through music, and lasting friendships transcending wartime enmity. The country music at Camp Como wasn't merely entertainment, but strategic demonstration of cultural continuity with lasting impact on German-American relations. Every chord progression matching German folk patterns, every melody paralleling volkslieder her grandfather taught, every finger-picking technique transmitted from German classical guitar to American folk style, was evidence that American culture preserved European traditions rather than representing alien replacement. This evidence created foundation for accepting American influence during occupation by presenting America as evolutionary development of European traditions Germans recognized. 40 years later, when Schneider returned to Tennessee carrying Henderson's guitar to perform together, recreating moment when terror transformed into recognition, their musical connection represented complete transformation from enemies to family that cultural recognition had enabled. Henderson's statement, "Music your ancestors helped create," captured how immigrant traditions preserved in America remained connected to European heritage despite centuries and oceans separating immigrant descendants from European homeland. The mathematics of that transformation were written in I-4-4 progressions appearing in both traditions, pentatonic melodies found in German and American folk songs, Wechselbass finger-picking patterns transmitted to Carter family picking, and ballad structures maintained across ocean and across 8 generations. These mathematical musical parallels proved cultural continuity more convincingly than historical arguments could, because they provided sensory evidence requiring no specialized knowledge to recognize. German women POWs who were terrified of Americans until they heard country music discovered that terror dissolved when they recognized familiar musical grammar in enemy culture. The E major to A major progression Henderson played was identical to progression German children learned in volkslieder. The finger-picking pattern was Wechselbass technique German classical guitarists had developed. The melodies were pentatonic scales German folk music had used for centuries. And the emotional content, songs about loss, displacement, longing for home, expressed feelings German prisoners understood intimately. What German women heard in Mississippi Recreation Hall wasn't just American country music. It was affirmation that American culture had German roots through immigrant traditions their own ancestors had carried to Appalachia. What they felt playing guitar alongside American soldiers wasn't just enjoyment of music, it was recognition of shared heritage transcending political divisions war had created. What they understood, returning to Germany with guitars and songbooks, wasn't just that Americans had treated them humanely. It was that American culture preserved European traditions, including German traditions that immigrants had maintained across 8 generations. The songbook documenting 50 paired songs showing American country music and German folk song connections became physical proof that cultural exchange could heal divisions war created. The historical notes explaining how German immigrants to Appalachia had transmitted volkslieder that evolved into country music demonstrated cultural continuity across centuries and ocean. And the musical notation showing identical chord progressions, melodic patterns, and structural elements in both traditions provided concrete evidence requiring no scholarly expertise to verify. That transformation from terror to understanding through musical recognition, documented in songbook, tested through 40 years of continued playing, confirmed through 1985 reunion performing together, proved that cultural bridges can transcend even catastrophic conflicts when people recognize shared heritage. The country music played at Camp Como wasn't just entertainment, but symbol of reconciliation achieved through discovering that enemies shared cultural roots despite propaganda depicting unbridgeable cultural gulf. The terror that had gripped German prisoners as they entered Recreation Hall expecting punishment transformed in 3 chords into recognition that enemies shared musical heritage. that Americans weren't culturally alien barbarians, but rather descendants of German immigrants who had preserved traditions Germany itself had modified. That music could stop terror by proving commonality more effectively than any words could convey. That shared chord progressions were more powerful than shared language for creating connection between enemies. And 40 years later, former prisoner and former guard playing together in Tennessee proved that recognition achieved through music in 1945 had created lasting bond transcending war, transforming enemies into family through discovering that country music's 3 chords in E major were identical to volkslieder's foundation, proving that terror transforms into understanding when enemies discover they share musical heritage spanning ocean and spanning 8 generations from Hamburg to Hamburg via Tennessee.